Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world tonight. I'm Mark Gillespie in the WhiskyCast studio in New Jersey. Hope you've had a great week. We have a fun show lined up for you today. My guest is Freddie Noe, the newly minted master distiller at the James B. Beam Distilling Company. Freddie, how are you today?
Doing great, Mark. How are you doing?
Doing great, especially with a glass of the new Hardins Creek Colonel James B. Beam in hand. You've been busy coming up with the new Hardins Creek range. Tell us about it.
Yeah, Hardins Creek was something that, to be honest with you, when I first started learning about my family's, I guess place in whiskey, the name Hardins Creek comes up because of Jacob Beam, who is my great 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 great, I believe that's right, grandfather, um, who came to Kentucky on a land grant. Basically to grow 100 acres of corn, and that's where he landed. There was on Hardins Creek. Um, I'd also, as I was listening to that, I heard or hearing this and reading about things. My granddad created Knob Creek. I had often wondered why we hadn't ever used the words Hardins Creek, given the prominence. I guess where I thought of it, and even Dad, talking with Dad, he agrees it's a very prominent place in our family's history to kind of tell that story. So, very, I guess, early in my career of learning of history, I decided that, this should be something we should talk about. And then, the first two releases, I think, are exceptional whiskeys. One of them, it was kind of something I conjured up and created, really to pay homage to Jim Beam himself. Colonel James B. Beam, as you see, is a signature on the bottom of the label of Jim Beam. And really, this was the first kind of liquid coming out of Prohibition that he released, was some 2-year-old whiskey that he wanted to get back into the industry. We really, my granddad, my dad, myself, think he's the strongest link in the family's history because he kind of ties the pre-Prohibition family distillers to the post-Prohibition, and really the linchpin of holding it together through that time for us. So, to me, to be able to honor him in this, and that's kind of where it started, and the opportunity with the use of Hardins Creek came about, and so this whiskey, I thought. As I mentioned to you just briefly as we were chatting, about whiskey on Hardins Creek, it's about, to me, letting the whiskey kind of do the talking, because there's a lot of, as I say, a lot of storytelling that comes with 226 years of distilling. Some of it good, some of it funny, some bad. A lot of it we laugh at either way now. That's the good part of being the eighth generation, is I get to tell stories, to folks like you, Mark, and fans around the world, and they laugh at some of the maybe the family shortcomings in the industry or things that have happened. So, but yeah, Hardins Creek's a place that will tell, like I said, do a lot of storytelling. These two, as I say, are kind of prominent figures in the history of my family. But in the future, there's a lot of opportunity for storytelling just around what I think is American whiskey. And I think, again, the second release, that Jacob's Well, again, paying homage to Jacob Beam, who, I've often think a lot about, and my dad, when we were kind of talking about this, even says, I'd love to know what old Jacob thought about, where the whiskey has come, or, where our family has come and where whiskey has come, because, I guess his father passed when he was 6 years old in Pennsylvania. He moved to his uncle's farm. I'd say he was a farmhand there. Really, through his uncle, got this opportunity to come to Kentucky, and sought this, probably just sought a piece of ground that he could call his own, and raise some grain and a family, I guess, would be the best thing. And he kind of set those roots. Started making whiskey there on Hardins Creek. Actually milled grain there as well. I think he just saw what quality ingredients could do for whiskey, and really probably helped get our family's name in whiskey through, just finding, Hardins Creek. He did have a well there. I visited it as a young boy with my granddad, actually. And I've been there actually twice since. I've taken some of our PR folks there. One of our ambassadors, he's been begging. He likes to ride four-wheelers and dirt bikes and things. He's been begging me to take him there, because it's pretty treacherous to get around to this area, and pretty well untouched by a human for quite some time. And it's just amazing to see the area. So, but the whiskey, again, it's a blend. It's really, I kind of took inspiration from Jacob's Well, and you can kind of see up here on maybe in the background, the original Jacob's Well release that Granddad did at the 200th anniversary was a blend of at 84 months and 84 proof, the high rye mash bill, the old Granddad mash bill, and our traditional Jim Beam mash bill. And I really thought that, I've done a lot of blending, as you know, with Little Book, and work with these whiskeys on a daily basis. And, to me, it's these whiskeys, I say, play well together. And so this opportunity to tell this story, telling Hardins Creek, I think it's only fitting you tell the story of Jacob and kind of why Hardins Creek even matters. And I think really that whiskey is, to me, it's one of the best whiskeys that I've tasted. Coming in 184 months, just over 15 years, again, that same kind of blend. And again, I said, I let the whiskey do the talking on this brand. I had this idea, so bringing them together close to a 50% ratio, not just at 50-50. We tasted them around, I'd say 48, down to 42 was the lowest we tasted. And really come on that, and then come on a proof point at 108. And ironically, the first two there, the Colonel and Jacob's Well, landed at 108 proof. We just did an exercise of tasting it at those proofs. And I think it's very exceptional flavor that comes through from, you get a lot of flavor, obviously, from the barrel on the Jacob's Well. And to me, the finish is just exceptional. Is why I really gravitate towards this profile. But I think it's just a great whiskey to kind of tell the story of a person who I get a lot of inspiration from, is Jacob, because I said, he just kind of, I watched that show 1883 where they go across the land there, and it reminds me probably a lot more wooded area, but a lot of what Jacob was just trying to get through to get here. And to think, he did that and learned this great, at that time, just, something every farmer did was distill. And I think, again, I think his opportunity to grow the native grain of corn and that great water source and grinding that grain for probably a lot of folks around the area, given, where the location of the creek was and things like that, saw a lot of bad grain, good grain. And so to me, I thought, having a whiskey that could uphold that exceptional quality and really uphold to that story is where we landed with that Jacob's Well, and kind of why those numbers, 184 months, and then at 108 proof were kind of prominent for me in that.
But the whiskey is ready when it's ready. If it's ready at 2 years or 184 months, right?
That's right. I think I had a desire to try to create a whiskey that could tell that story for I guess, my great-great-grandfather, Jim Beam, Colonel James B. Beam. He was coming out of Prohibition, didn't have whiskey. His whole sentiment from his daughter, who told my dad firsthand, he lived with, he called her Aunt Mimi, which would be my grandfather's sister. He did not want anything to do with, having whiskey or anything during Prohibition. So he got rid of the property and basically started doing other things did pick up the old Murphy Barber Distillery, obviously where we are in Claremont during Prohibition, or there towards the end, in Quarry Rock there. But to come out of Prohibition and release a 2-year-old whiskey, and to know your family was very prominent in whiskey prior, I guess it says a lot to know good quality whiskey, right? And so to me, I'd taken some things I'd heard from Granddad and some things Dad and I had talked about and done, and done some lower distillation proof as well in the still, which I think brings more flavor over from our process of fermentation, and the yeast, our family yeast strain. And so to me, if you're going to bring more flavor over from that, it's a great highlight, and went into a standard barrel and we just tasted it, or I was kind of giddy to taste it every 6 months. And, I'd said to some of our blending team, I wanted to release it at 2 years old if there could be a good balance of flavor. And I think the whiskey did an exceptional job of telling me that, right, that it could. And one of them I was very close with. We had lunch. We started very similar times. He had told another buddy that works in the distillery, he said, "You're going to have to tell Freddie, he's got to think about it if we're going to release a 2-year-old whiskey." He said, "I just don't think we can do that." And the day after he collected the samples, we're ready to taste when it turned 2 years old. He was sitting in my office, and I thought, normally he brings me kind of off samples or maybe even exceptional samples, but no samples in hand. And he just kind of, he said, "I wanted to apologize. I thought you were crazy, maybe even need to be drug tested, to say, we were going to release this at 2 years old, and it was only at 6 months old as we were, as I'd said that." But again, I think running a good fermentation process and bringing a lot of flavor through that in distillation, coming over at, right at about 115 proof, it was going into the barrel. Obviously, no water added there, going in that low, but coming off the still that low, more flavor coming over. And I think what you saw is more interaction too with the barrel at a little bit younger age as well, is why I think it has that just exceptional rounded kind of flavor is, because of that, it allowed more of that some of those vanillas to start popping a little bit, and really a lot of what I call kind of hints of caramel coming through for me. And that's what would really set it apart. And then, I'll switch up. I'll have that one poured as well. It's just, to me, again, I think the whiskey kind of said, hey, it's meant to expand people's perception too of what bourbon or even American whiskey can be. If you start with good quality ingredients and you understand your process and you deliver a whiskey that can be of exceptional quality at a younger age, then I think it's important to kind of share that. And so it's very fitting for me to tell that story along with the Colonel James B. Beam story, and him, like I say, coming back from Prohibition, really getting started at 70 years old in 121 days it's kind of crazy. We just started up the Freddie Noe distillery, and it took us a hell of a lot longer with probably a boatload more equipment and more hands, I would say. So it just a great sentiment to Jim Beam.
And a lot more lawyers too, probably.
Oh yeah.
How does that new distillery figure into the plans for Hardins Creek going forward? Are you going to see a lot of the stuff you're making at the new distillery going into Hardins Creek?
Absolutely. I think it's a prime spot. Just kind of give them a batch size and a lot of the kind of foundational research we're going to be doing, as well as kind of, I would say, off the wall things I've got going on. I was texting the manager yesterday about an idea I had, and I wasn't telling him exactly what I wanted to do. I was kind of just beating around the bush to really get perspective on, the process of adding something in these areas. And he's like, "You're just going to have to tell me. You've said too much to not tell me exactly what's on your mind." And so I kind of told him, and he was anxious, obviously, to see what happened, but probably a little nervous as well. And I'm sure he didn't know he would sign up for those kind of late afternoon text conversations. But, some of these things will definitely play right into Hardins Creek. Again, like I said, I think it'll be a great storytelling piece for American whiskey. And again, from really, if you think about it, as I'm saying, the origins of our family in 1795, as Jacob landed on Hardins Creek, and kind of teasing maybe a little bit into some of what I've done and maybe even haven't done yet in the distillery, will probably fall on Hardins Creek. So there's a long range of things, and I would say process changes, a lot of different things that are have occurred across time that we can maybe tweak or pull levers on to test and see where flavor of whiskey is really coming from. And I think Hardins Creek is the place that will be telling that story. So, yeah.
When you're working on innovations, how are you going to decide between what goes into Hardins Creek and what goes into the various Little Book expressions?
So a lot of it will depend on kind of, and you may see some of it in both, right? Potentially, just depending on what happens and where those things go. But a lot of it will be, or I guess I could say, kind of work we're looking at for Little Book in the early days are things we've already talked about that we'd like to maybe try in making whiskey for blends versus making whiskey, which I guess we're making whiskey for guardrail and have guardrails for Knob Creek, Basil, Booker's, obviously the different kind of versions of things we've done as well with a brown rice, bourbon, and other ryes. And so we're doing those things, and so I guess what I'd say is, as we're looking at for Little Book in the early days, it's about things we've talked about as we've blended for Little Book of how we would go about getting whiskeys that are meant for blending for Little Book. To me, I would say on Hardins Creek, those kinds of things will be more about the whiskey, and it won't necessarily be a blend. This Colonel James B. Beam, is a blend of barrels of the same, I guess, process, tanking process. So, but still a blend of barrels. But with Jacob's Well, it's a blend of two different streams. You might see more of blend of different streams or standalones as well. And I guess I may tease and say it may, as I've said, it may not just be bourbon. It could be other things in American whiskey as well.
I have to ask, as a journalist, I know you're not going to give me the answer, but what can we expect to see from the next chapter of Little Book coming out later this year?
Just a little bit too early.
I know.
If maybe this time in July, we could maybe give a good tease, but I guess I would say it's definitely something different. You haven't seen on Little Book for sure. Kind of a little bit different process than typical. So definitely something to look for. And I would say equally as anxious to hear people's perspective, because I think, as I've said before in the past, Little Book is about kind of pushing the boundary of flavor in American whiskey blending, right? A blending of American whiskey. And so this is kind of one of those, I guess I would say, adventures or ventures that I think will be interesting for people to try, and I hope people are equally excited to enjoy it.
Fair enough. I have to ask the question at least.
Oh yeah, a little bit early.
We have a great comment from Malt Mariners in Germany. Whenever a Scotch snob tells me U.S. whiskey has no tradition, I tell them about the Noe dynasty and then pour them and myself a Booker's.
I like it. That's a good comment there. Speaking of Booker's, the whiskey for Booker's, like I said, is untouched by water for this Colonel James B. Beam. That's what Granddaddy's sentiment was too. And so to me, people ask me where I think Booker sits. I think it sits in of the purest of whiskeys, because the only water that goes into it is the mash process water at the beginning of the process. And from that point, it's really, like I say, a kind of a distiller's specialty and cut, right? It's coming from the center and the heart of the warehouse. My dad does the, I'm sure Granddaddy might have something to say about me using the word blending or potentially pulling that into Booker's, but he's blending those barrels and creating those profiles. And I'd say if Granddaddy didn't think that blending would have such a different term in his time, would maybe use that word, but he would use mingling. And so to me, when you mingle those barrels that come off the still right at 125 proof and they sit around that area where they get a little bit of proof, but a lot of interaction between, cool and hot, I think you just get that amazing whiskey. And one, I like to sip Booker's with a little bit of ice where it melts and you really kind of see how just a little bit of that water changes the flavor and really opens it up and changes it.
When do you start picking barrels for Booker's and take over from your dad on that job?
I've stepped in a couple of times on kind of, I was more on maybe a freak accidental thing where something happened. We didn't have approval and it's kind of in the waning moments, and I stepped in. And then another situation where my dad uses the story to tell about how he knew I would be good in the industry because I caught, again, just a final quick approval of the tank after it had been dumped. I caught that it just didn't taste, it didn't smell right, and it didn't taste just like Booker's. And I went back, they proofed it, and it was lowest proof by Booker's that it would ever have been by standard, and by like 4 or 5 proof points. So come to find out, the tank had been rinsed and maybe a little bit of water had been added. And so those 2 instances, and then he asked me to help him on a couple of them as well. And so I've obviously I know the process, and I've sat through it. And even from the warehousing perspective of collecting samples, in my early days, my task was to help go out and do the Booker's batching for Dad. So I don't know. Like I say, from time to time, he lets me taste them all as he kind of picks them. He kind of does the Granddaddy. Granddaddy would be sitting at the kitchen table and would have, if his buddies were there, maybe a neighbor walking by, usher him in there and have him pick between 3 glasses. He'd already had it picked or was gonna pick, and would ask. But like I say, I think Dad's already showing me what he's narrowed in on. And so, like I say, from time to time he asks my perspective, but generally I'm still kind of, I guess I would say, apprenticing to his Booker's batching, which I enjoy watching. And again, like I said, I get to taste, so I'll stick in my spot on that position right now.
We have a question for you from Chris Ratcliffe about Hardins Creek. Will these new rare specialist expressions integrate into the new Jim Beam Visitor Center tours, or are you going to treat these differently? And you just opened the all-new Visitor Center experience in Claremont.
That's right. I mean, the opportunity there, we kind of rebranded what we had called the American Stillhouse back to our original Visitor Center name, which was the American Outpost. If you had visited, it was a kind of old red barn that then transformed into a tasting barn. But at the Outpost, we will sell these liquids. And then also with our new restaurant, I've potentially looking at some dinners where we may taste some of these, whether it's Hardins Creek or other LTO liquids across the portfolio. But it'll definitely play into those things in events, but still kind of be spread and distributed as well. But so if you're around, there will be opportunities to pick those up on campus.
We have a suggestion from Crump the Cask Hole. I think we need a kilted book, basically you blending some of the Beam Suntory single malts. Sort of a reverse version of what your dad and Shinji Fukuyo did with Legion.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea. I might have to take that one down. I don't know about
that. Sounds like fun.
I guess the question back would be, will I have to wear a kilt? And then at that point, we may have to change the name. We have to come up with a different name there. So I don't know about it. My dad used to travel. I don't know. I'm sure you saw with the great whiskey debate where he would debate with our Scotch colleague on really just kind of, again, spinning facts of what is America, I guess what is bourbon or American whiskey, what is Scotch, and there was tasting involved, and we go back and forth. And my dad would always get called a hillbilly from Kentucky that didn't wear shoes, and then he'd make fun of the kilt. So he would get on me if I kind of went to that look, given it was kind of this big prop in the whiskey debate. So
you could do it once. I did.
Yeah.
For a formal thing. There are no pictures of it, thank God.
Oh, are you sure of that?
I'm pretty sure. They would have come up by now. Another question from Chris Ratcliffe is, Freddie is the younger of his profession. How do you see bourbons standing with the upcoming generations of drinkers? How do younger drinkers enjoy bourbon or get excited by things? What are you seeing from your generation?
What's interesting to me is I think there's a curiosity that comes with this next generation, or my generation, of wanting to understand things that are I guess you're consuming, whether it be food or spirit. So, but also I think curiosity in exploration. I think there's obviously a great curiosity in American whiskey right now. As the industry, but I think the next generation of drinkers will only begin to fuel, or I guess keep fuel on the fire for what's coming in whiskey. And so I think things like this Hardins Creek, where you see two expressions kind of on two ends of the spectrum as far as an age, but on quality and perception of quality, I think right there neck and neck. And so I know a lot of my buddies have been very excited to when can I come try that? I want to understand your thinking there. And so again, I think there's a lot of curiosity with that. I think another aspect is, ways to consume, through cocktails, things like that. And so finding ways to connect with a broader demographic of consumers. I think that's really what the next generation is looking for to begin with, is that connection to a broader range of in this case products, and so I think they'll fit in very well in the whiskey category. And again, I think the way things are going, it will be a great time for people to understand American whiskey, and that's what it's all about.
Another question from Graham Fraser in the UK. How important do you think yeast is in the whiskey process? You've been using the family yeast strain, right?
Big
for
time.
Generations.
Jim Beam caught the yeast strain, 55 yards from where I'm sitting in the kitchen, just starting up after Prohibition. And really, I think it's extremely important. There's flavors. If you taste our distillate coming straight off the still, we did Camp Runamuck with a lot of bartenders last week, and I tasted them on distillate. And we did a little blending exercise across some of the whiskeys. And one of the biggest comments was the kind of nuttiness that comes out on the distillate. And you see that kind of later in our whiskeys age as well. And I think people kind of claim that as the beam, kind of distinct beam flavor a lot of times in things. And that's from that yeast. And that's really a derivative from that, like I say, process. We still do a natural fermentation, so we're not using any enzymes outside of the malted barley. Still using lake water to mash with, the same lake water Jim Beam did. And so I think that distinct flavor is carrying from the yeast into our process, and then on into the finished product, especially when you get into some of the upper age expressions. And then maybe even, I think specifically as you start looking at our lower distillation proofed expressions like this Colonel James B. Beam. There's not to tease too much. There's something we're working on for my dad where we've done some different distillation as well. You pick it up there, and even in Booker's and things like that around the 125 proof mark, it becomes more, I'd say, more prominent. You can pick it up in Jim Beam, but I think more prominent for the average consumer down when we get a little bit lower distillation proof. And so I think it plays a huge part into it. I think that's why I spent a lot of my first days in the distillery focused on yeast and fermentation to understand, why we've kept our process the way we have, And there's good examples in whiskey that can show you why when you change those things, it has an impact on your whiskey. But we've stuck by that natural process, and I know as long as I'm master distiller, that's what we'll be doing for all of our whiskey, because that yeast interacting with that process is what gives us a lot of our flavor, and the distinction, I think, is huge there. So huge part of it. Great question.
We have a question from Connor O'Hare in Ireland, and Connor works at Cooley Distillery, which is part of your company. He wants to know what your favorite Irish whiskey is, Tyrconnell or Connemara.
I got to go with the Connemara. To be honest, I'll lean that way. But I've enjoyed both. I'll say that. So it's not that one's getting thrown to the wayside. Yeah, that's a great question.
Do you have a favorite Scotch?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I don't know. I don't know if I could pin one for you. There's a few popular. I'd hate to make a claim because there's a lot of distinction there. So I don't know if I want to make a claim just yet. I need to do some more research. So
more research is always appropriate.
I was going to say, save that question. I'll be back on, I'm sure, next time, and you'll have to ask me again, Mark. And if I'm ready, I'll make an explanation. I'll explain my theory then and why and which one. So
we'll save that question for the next time.
Yeah.
Then another one from Chris Ratcliffe. Was there ever a chance that you weren't going to go into the whiskey business? And what other careers might you have gone into?
I mean, I love playing football, so obviously I wanted to play in the NFL. That was an idea, right? But never came close to fruition at all. So that was a young idea. Then a lawyer was another one as I was kind of getting close to the end of high school. But to be honest with you, my granddad passed, and I like playing video games. So I thought if I could develop games, I'd do that, or help finish them out and play them. That'd even be better. But nothing ever serious other than distilling. My granddad passed when I was 16, and so many people paid their respect, to me, who I didn't know. A lot of them I did, but so many of them were impacted by my granddad through their life, whether it be job or maybe inspiration in the industry, or just, how he taught them bourbon, and they, went on to be a salesman for us. And so to see the impact that whiskey had, I guess, had on my young life, right, just through people paying respect to me, it grabbed my attention at a very young age. And so I always would say, kind of from that point, I butted heads with my dad. What teenage boy doesn't? I would say I don't want to be a part of it. But it was always in my mind. I wanted to explore, what the whiskey industry had for me, because, like I said, so many people coming and paying their respect, and a large percentage of them were either touched through work at the plant or through the whiskey industry, and it like I said, grabbed my attention pretty quickly.
Comment from Greg Serafian in Paris. He says, just ask Eddie McCaffer at Bowmore to try some Warehouse One old Bowmore 64 cask, and you'll probably have your answer on that favorite Scotch.
Noted. I got that noted. I'll have to get in there.
What was it like being on the stage with your dad a couple of weeks ago when they're dedicating the new visitors center, and he springs this deal on you that you're going to be master distiller? I mean, we knew you were going to get the title sooner or later, but your dad didn't get it till after your granddad had passed.
Yeah,
so, that's the first time two family members have held the title at the same time.
I know, it's kind of crazy, because there's been a lot of family members that have been distillers. Even if you just take, Baker Beam and his father and their time, right, and association next to Uncle Jerry, and then Granddaddy, So it's kind of weird that there hadn't ever been that before, right? Given the depth of beams that have been in the distilling, especially at our facility. So, but it was a great honor. I knew something was going on only because it kind of seemed, my dad was practicing up for this speech, And he typically he's pretty good on, on the spot on speaking. So I knew there's something he was going to say, but who thinks they're going to wake up one day and their dad's going to name a master distiller, right? It's kind of one of those things, like my dad had said, it's an honor thing as well. It's an honor to be a master distiller because you kind of represent facility and brands, and so to your point, right? I guess even if you tell me, it's still kind of hard for me to believe because it's something I wanted to be for so long, but being there with my dad, the governor being there, our CEO, Albert Bellotti, even more interesting, I hadn't invited anybody other than my wife, right, obviously, and my children. But last minute, I asked my father-in-law and mother-in-law to join us. So got the extended family there, and again, I was pretty surprised, and so they got to kind of see that, and it's pretty cool, right? And like I said, both my grandkid or my dad got to announce it in front of his granddaughter, and his obviously Booker won't remember much of it, but me having my kids there, my dad with his grandkids and whole family, and being able to pull the surprise off, right, without kind of prompting me to bring them. Yeah, it was a great time. So and then I guess even not to be remiss, Baker Beam was there as well. One of the first ones to congratulate me coming off the stage there. And then another great, came up and took some photos with Jimmy Russell. I'm not sure if you saw the photo, but photo of me, my dad, and Jimmy there right after. Again, you talk about Granddaddy and how he had an impact on whiskey, and Jimmy being so close with him and them traveling a lot together to talk about bourbon and get it going, right? They kind of got it going for what we see in bourbon today. And so it just means a lot to even have him sitting there, as a real extended family member. So great day, surrounded by family and friends, and again, beautiful weather. So it just turned out to be a nice day, and just a lot of pride to be able to officially, I guess, kind of represent, the brands that my family has created and kind of bestowed on me to be the custodian of. So I'm very excited for the opportunity.
And you got it a lot sooner than Jimmy gave the title to Eddie.
I know it. That's good, I guess, right? I mean, it comes with a lot of hard work. That's what, my wife asked me, how's it feel? And I'm like, it feels good, but there's a lot of people to thank. That was my big thing, is I wish I had prepared something to, or had the opportunity, to thank a lot of the former distillers, even, that taught me from the way Granddad learned. Even some of the ones still there, the operators that worked across my dad, me, and Granddad, telling me, your granddad was here, we'd come change that temperature. I'd walk out here and I'd shimmy that chain that was 7 stories up, and he'd tell me that when he first started, he had to shimmy his ass all the way to the top to make that change. So just to be able to have that perspective across those generations from different people, it really, again, I think it helped me become the distiller I am, and understand where my family's come from in the distilling industry. And so again, like I said, I think it's a big opportunity for me, and very excited to kind of continue to share those stories, and again, share the stories of the folks that have taught me as well. Get the opportunity to tell some more about those folks as well.
How much of the job is PR, and how much of it is actually hands-on, getting dirty in the still house?
Well, I mean, I don't get too dirty, so we've got a union environment.
But you know what I mean.
Yeah. I'd say 60-40. I wouldn't say the PR. I would say a lot of meetings, and as we said before, there's a lot of brands with Knob Creek, Booker's, Basil Hayden, Baker's. My dad and me are a part of the kind of teams that kind of developed the guardrails around, how do we innovate on these brands? What do these brands stand for? What do they mean? And so we kind of uphold those guardrails. We sit in the meetings to kind of educate people on those guardrails. So there's a lot of that too, right? We got new people coming all the time to the team, and working with them is important. And then, yeah, there is PR and things like this too as well, right? Where I kind of reach on the outside, but internal training as well. But a lot of it is kind of get in there and I spend a lot of time talking with Greg Davis. He oversees distillation at Claremont Booker Noe. I work closely with another lady, Kathy Reynolds. She oversees a lot of our kind of special things. Like when I come up with Hardins Creek, I got to kind of go talk with Kathy and make sure we're going to be okay on how we move the barrels, where they're at, and all that, and the kind of formality of it. And so working closely with those folks, it's is a lot of the role as well, right? There is some hands-on dirty things. I get to see our operators a lot of times, maybe in clogged up. My office sits right by the granary at the new distillery. So if there's vacuum problems or issues going on in the granary, I can see them and I get to kind of go watch and observe because, before being a supervisor, you're quickly troubleshooting things, and there's we've handed down a lot of knowledge, got a lot of knowledge about our process, and so seeing the team react to these things is cool and great to be a part of. So probably not as dirty as it would have been for a lot of my ancestors, but there's a lot of kind of hands-on things that I think are critical to keep the whiskey quality where it needs to be, but keep the team in an understanding of kind of how I say the beam way of whiskey making, and it goes into the process right back to that natural fermentation all the way through to our blending process for each of those brands. So there's a lot of things that go into the role.
You mentioned being a supervisor. You didn't just get handed this title. You had to work your way up from pushing barrels and doing all the grunt work, right?
No, that's right. I started as I got really a special project coordinator was my role, but essentially I was an additional supervisor kind of hand for 2.5 years across each department from the distillery. Started in the granary at 4:30 my first week, 4:30 a.m. All the way through from distillery, byproduct, into the warehousing department, processing, receiving, where we get glass, bottling. What am I leaving out? Shipping, where we ship out. I spent a lot of time in shipping. We had a few folks leave the team while I was down there, so I extended my time there to help out the team. And really, I enjoyed that because I got to interact with so many people that touch our products, and I can really kind of sit in on really any kind of meeting around the process to understand how we're improving it. And it was an enjoyable time. Then I went into bottling supervisor for about 1.5 2 years, and then distillery supervisor for about 2.5 years before I was right at a fermentation coordinator was my next role. So moved from supervisor on staff, kind of on 24/7 supervision, kind of over to a day shift position where I would interact with third, first, and second, kind of in doing experimentation. Really, kind of the early days of showcasing the want and the need for a place like the Freddie Noe Distillery was kind of where that fermentation coordinator started before I kind of shifted into, I guess, 8th generation distiller from that.
Question from Chris Ratcliffe. Let's fast forward a few years to you getting to put your name on a whiskey like your granddad did with Booker's. Let's call it Freddie's Cask, as Chris Ratcliffe does. What would it be?
It's too early to tell, I'd say. I guess the one thing I would say is I'm hopeful that by making it a blend, I guess if it has to be a single stream, then it may not necessarily be bourbon, just because a lot of the exploration I'll be doing over the next coming years in this distillery and really pushing the boundaries on innovation. It'd be hard for me to make that comment now, but I think what you would see is it definitely be Cask-Strength. Now, whether it's lower distillation proof like we've done on this Colonel James B. Beam, maybe even lower, but I think it will be a place where it's kind of from the distiller, maybe through the warehouse, because that's a process that I think is natural, right? You take a tree, make a barrel out of this individual tree, and then age this whiskey in it for a period of time, and then maybe through to the blending part, right, where I've really spent. So it could be a blend of American whiskeys that we've created, but it'll be a cask strength, and then hopefully of something of, again, it'll be of high quality that I think hopefully can create a conversation around American whiskey. That's what I'd love, because I think there's a lot of flavor in American whiskey that I think you'll see over the next, hopefully, quite a few years in the industry. And it really stands that in a real strong place in whiskey across international as well.
You talk about American whiskey, and there are folks that think of that as they get this connotation of American blended whiskey, the sort of lower grade stuff that doesn't necessarily have a lot of quality to it. How do you get people past that preconception to try things like Little Book and to try what can really be good blends?
I think a lot of it is transparency. I think I'm using, or I guess in the early days with Little Book, I was hoping to be able to use my family's credentials in whiskey for people to kind of take that leap into, as you say, a place where it maybe hasn't had the highest connotation before. And so with that, I was very transparent, been transparent with Little Book, what's in it, always will be. And then everything that comes as well in our family, we're very transparent about how we do our process and make our whiskeys. And so I think, I hope in what I've created with Little Book, and then kind of expanding, in a different region with Hardins Creek, and how we can be transparent about the process of whiskey making. With those things, it hopefully is something that if they see the name, it gives them that I guess kind of assurance that, hey, I should take this leap and try this, because again, I think a lot of the whiskey we'll be doing, I think we'll do talking through me, and then hopefully there is a conversation to be had by others, right? Not just me and the distillery team or the blending team. More broadly, these whiskeys have a conversation to share, I guess. So you'll see a lot of that.
Question from Pierre Mullen in Canada. When formulating a new whiskey expression, do you design some to be enjoyed neat versus on a big cube of ice, or do you always try to balance them being served multiple ways, including cocktails?
I think you hit it there on the head at the end. It's about a balance, right? I mean, some of it even, new whiskey expressions sometimes come on like Knob Creek or Basil, where you're kind of locked in with a proof point, maybe even an age, or with Basil, kind of this perception around kind of approachability is really one thing we're looking to bring new people into the industry with. So those kind of things kind of lean you in one way, definitely. So
I think we have pretty much exhausted all the time we can take of yours tonight, because I know it's time for you to get home to the family, to the kids and your wife. Freddie Noe, thank you for joining us tonight on the Happy Hour Live webcast.
Anytime. It's always been always a pleasure to be able to talk about, family, have a sip of great whiskey and talk about whiskey, and hopefully get people excited about the future of American whiskey as well. So anytime, Mark, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you. These two, both Jacob's Well and the Colonel James B. Beam Hardins Creek whiskeys, both excellent in my opinion. I had tasting notes for them a couple of weeks ago on the show. I'll have them up on the website soon, but I thought they were just excellent. Thank you again.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mark. Have a good weekend.
And you two have a great weekend. And thanks to you for watching. I appreciate all of you for giving us a little bit of your time on Friday nights. No webcast next week because I will be traveling and we'll be on an airplane and not able to join you at 5 o'clock next Friday, but we'll be back on Thursday night, the 16th, 2 weeks from now. We're going to do a special show at the Doers U.S. Open party in Boston for the U.S. Open golf tournament. We're going to do a special show next week or 2 weeks from now, Thursday, June 16th. I'll have details for it on our social media feeds. We'll have the exact time for you. I think it's going to be 6:30 or 7 o'clock. We're still working all that out. But we will be on 2 weeks from now, Thursday night, June 16th. Have a great weekend. We'll see you soon. Good night, all.